one of the themes throughout the film is Freudian sexual, psychoanalysis type stuff. But the point of that is that just like he's struggling with his own sexuality in his marriage, he realizes that the elite, they use sexuality as a currency to control the masses. So I think that those are the key elements of what Eyes Wide Shut is trying to tell us, is that we're actually ruled by elites who have no morals, no moral compass whatsoever. They're absolutely satanic. And even though the film doesn't explicitly mention Satanism or Crowley, the very ominous sort of reversal music that's played is actually something that Aleister Crowley was into, which was taking music or taking speech and reversing it to teach people the principle of what he called inversion, or taking good things and proper things and then inverting them to their opposite. A lot of people have a satanic worldview or a very dark hermetic worldview. They think that you can actually gain power by doing that.
If you haven't seen the movie Eyes Wide Shut, I'm not suggesting you go and do that. It's about elite sex rituals that are meant to solidify hierarchy, power, and control. When the film was released, it was dismissed as kind of boring and unrealistic. Now, in light of the Epstein files, it reads as psychologically accurate, honest, and maybe even restrained. The film's director, Stanley Kubrick, died after he made the final edits, so he was never able to be asked about it. So the question is, why did Hollywood elites allow this film to be shown? What are we seeing here? How do we know? What are we looking at? So Jay Dyer, welcome back to Redacted. Thank you so much for joining us. You wrote this on X the other day, and I thought we would have you explain it. You said, this is real. It puts the famous Rothschild's mask ball photos in a new light. This has been going on for a long time. So I'm just going to hand you the floor and explain to us what the hell.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be back with you guys. Yeah, I wrote a really in-depth analysis of Eyes Wide Shut, kind of a academic style essay maybe in 2011. And I got quite a bit of attention from it because people started noticing, hey, this aspect of the ritual, this aspect of the tie into Hollywood, there's actually history behind a lot of this. And Kubrick, as a somewhat of a counter establishment figure, was putting a lot of messages into his films. And so I was studying film at a graduate level as well in terms of propaganda at the same time. So the deeper I dove into this, I started realizing that in the academic literature, which most people don't actually read, not that they would, I mean, it's just for a bunch of nerds, they started coming out with books 10, 15 years ago about the relationship of the CIA to Hollywood at an academic level, right? So normal people aren't reading this. This isn't really in the media. You had, even right after 9/11, there was academic texts like Operation Hollywood. And what these books were describing was this intimate relationship between high-level A-listers, producers, directors, the Pentagon, the NSA, the FBI, as well as other foreign intelligence agencies, obviously the Mossad and British intelligence. And so turns out there's always been this really close relationship between film, propaganda, the deep state, intelligence agencies, and it turns out sex cults. And so I thought that Kubrick's film was just so profound in that it ties in all of that stuff together, because if you don't recall, or if you're not aware, the narrative of the story is that Tom Cruise is this sort of, wealthy, mid-level New York elite doctor who gets invited to a very, say, higher tier billionaire level party. And the invitation is sort of mysterious. We don't exactly know if he's supposed to be there, if he's not supposed to be there. But what he stumbles upon is essentially there's a tier of people above him that are engaged in international or ritual sex type stuff, including murders, assassinations, probably suggesting other things, with the Lily Sobieski character being underage trafficking of girls and so forth. And there's even a curious line in the film where when the Tom Cruise character goes to the costume store and he says, what do I need for a masked ball, a Renaissance style masked ball? And the director, the owner of the costume store, who's a trafficker himself connected to the network, they say, you're going to need this special cloak. And so that is a cloak worn specifically by royals in Europe and in the UK. And so when Tom Cruise stumbles upon this and gets to this big event here, he sees this mass ritual orgy. It's a black mass, essentially. It's very Crowleyan in terms of Aleister Crowley style rituals. And ultimately we find out this is a network that is compromising and is essentially controlling the wealthiest people. In this case, in New York, probably the East Coast as well. The guy has a British accent that sort of runs the cult, the Hierophant. So long story short, I think the phrase eyes wide shut is essentially describing the fact that back in the late 90s when Kubrick did this film, most people's eyes were wide shut. They were open, but they're shut to how the world really works, which is what this film is about. And if you go back to my book, the very first chapter, I talked about how this is describing the strategy and the techniques of the Rothschild masked balls, as you put up. So just the masked ball essentially was I think, a perfect setup for how you could compromise people. And that's kind of what we get with Tom Cruise and his character in this sequence, is that he's brought in, he's perhaps being inducted, it's unclear, but he's definitely in the position of being compromised. And we notice throughout the film's narrative that this cult has all of the powers and abilities of an intelligence agency at their disposal. They're able to fake the news stories, they're able to assassinate, right? And there's this cult element where the other model who takes the place of Tom Cruise says, don't kill him, I will be the sacrifice for him, I will redeem him. And that has to do with earlier in the film, because Tom Cruise's character is a doctor. He saved her life at that first party. So look, this is high level stuff. This is telling us everything about how the world really works. It's based on an older German novel called Traumnovelle. And I think that novel was updated by Kubrick on purpose to tell us they're really into this underage stuff. And that's also a theme in many Kubrick films. Lolita, Barry Lyndon, on and on and on. Dr. Strangelove, you have this idea that the elite want younger people to abuse, to traumatize, and they run the world through these cult networks.
So I want to get into Stanley Kubrick in a second, because I've studied his films for years, and when I went to film school back in the day, I want to get into that piece of this and his mysterious death, and of course the edit that we never got to see. So just put that on the back burner for a second. But you mentioned the Rothschild's balls. Forgive the way of saying it.
Well, he has pictures. If we could put them up, they're incredibly
Don't put
creepy.
pictures of their balls up.
Yeah, don't put the Rothschild's balls up. I don't want to see those things. But
let's call them galas.
Yeah, let's call them galas. So, Jay, what happens at these galas? What exactly are we looking at here, and what is the history of these things?
These are older images from the 60s and 70s where they were inviting very prominent people. In fact, some of the pictures include people like Audrey Hepburn being at these balls. And, this is, I think, an old European tradition. So the ball itself is nothing new. I've done research in my grad studies on Renaissance era mass balls. And what the elite would do is you bring all these people to these sort of Saturnalian parties where you have orgies, shall we say. And that goes back to, like I said, medieval Europe. And for a long time, it could be a very excellent, it's a perfect setting to compromise people. So if you go into the history of sexual blackmail and these kinds of operations, the Rothschilds were at the front of this for many, many centuries. In fact, in terms of Epstein himself, the Robert Maxwell was a front for the Rothschild operation, and I think you guys have talked to Whitney Webb. The first few chapters of her book detail how Maxwell was brought in as a frontispiece, a kind of a facade for the Rothschilds to be a corporate takeover artist, to be this publishing magnate that was a front to cut out. And that was all at the behest of both British intelligence and Israel as well at the same time. So the Rothschilds seem to really be perfect at this. It's a science that they perfected. In fact, there's some information and indications. People have written some books theorizing that if you go back to the Cambridge spy ring and the famous story of the Soviets that defected, many of whom were, by the way, homosexual. The reason that matters is because they were very close to Lord Victor Rothschild, who many people suspect was the key a person behind that Cambridge spy ring, because he was playing both sides, both British intelligence and playing the side of the Soviets. And there was that famous email that came out from Epstein a few days ago explaining that, well, the reason that Maxwell was assassinated was because he tried to extort the Mossad, whom he worked for, appointing himself as an attaché for Israel to the Soviets. And the KGB actually had translations that my friend did where they were, during the Cold War, they had the exact same assessment of Maxwell. He's playing both sides. He's trying to feed us secrets as he's trying to extort the Mossad. And that was supposedly, according to Epstein, the reason why they took him out. Now, the reason I say all that is that, again, this is, as Epstein himself says, and a Rothschild operation. He is a agent, an attaché, a legate of the Rothschilds. Many emails confirm this, including business deals beyond just being a legate. And again, that's because they have this long-time connection, not just to intelligence and to apparently cults, as well as the history of the nation state of Israel, going all the way back to the 1860s, according to Moses Hess. It's also because they're an elite, powerful European banking dynasty. And intelligence really comes out of banking. This is something a lot of people understand. They think, oh, it's James Bond, it's assassinating people, it's this, that. That's a lower level. The real origin of intelligence, even according to the mainline Rothschild biographers, like the Morton text, which is an official biography of the Rothschilds, within the first few chapters, the famous story about Waterloo, that they had advanced intelligence that allowed them to buy up the collapsed stock market in the UK and London. That's true. They all brag about that. They're like, yeah, absolutely. And the way we were able to do that was advanced intelligence. It's not an accident that when David Rockefeller sets up his banking empire, it's because he comes out of military intelligence. He brags about that in his memoirs. So we got to understand that intelligence, cults, networks, and even Hollywood all tie together. There's no perfect example than this.
Wow.
So what do you think Eyes Wide Shut was trying to tell us? Were they trying to warn us, or it's because it's part of their ethos to tell us to do it in plain sight?
So I've gotten to know Vivian Kubrick, Kubrick's daughter, since writing my books and doing all this. And we've had a lot of conversations. And the way Vivian describes it is that she says her dad was a genuinely anti-establishment person. She thinks that he did have some spiritual sensibilities about him, even though he was kind of agnostic. He did believe in, inexplicable, mysterious types of phenomena. So he wasn't like a total rank materialist per se, but she said that his perspective was that, he had seen a lot, done a lot. When he was younger, he was a little more naive when it came to Spartacus and films where he was perhaps more so on the socialist communist side. And after many years, as he got, more mature and older, the themes in his films, I think, really are accurate. So I don't think Kubrick was intentionally part of a conspiracy or trying to cover things up. I think he really was saying, look, here's what's really going on. People don't understand it. I don't know any other way to convey it other than the art form that I've chosen, this medium. But I would say in terms of the film itself, again, it's almost like the film is a ritual itself. It's kind of an initiation process, because the character Bill Harford is, totally eyes wide shut at the beginning. He doesn't know how the world really works. He thinks he's at the elite top of, the power structure. He's a very successful, wealthy, multi-million-dollar doctor in New York. And then he meets this whole other class of people who live a totally different, untouchable, free from any legalities, doing whatever they want, do what thou wilt worldview. And he's totally mystified. He has no idea it just totally destroys his world. And one of the themes throughout the film is Freudian, sexual, psychoanalysis type stuff. I won't go too deep into that, but the point of that is that just like he's struggling with his own sexuality in his marriage, he realizes that the elite, they use sexuality as a currency to control the masses. So I think that those are the key elements of what Eyes Wide Shut is trying to tell us, is that we're actually ruled by elites who have no morals, no moral compass whatsoever. They're absolutely satanic. And even though the film doesn't explicitly mention, Satanism or Crowley, the very ominous sort of reversal music that's played is actually something that Aleister Crowley was into, which was taking music or taking speech and reversing it to teach people the principle of what he called inversion, or taking good things and proper things and then inverting them to their opposite. A lot of people who have a satanic worldview or a very dark, hermetic worldview, they think that you can actually gain power by doing that. And perhaps if the film is portraying this ritual perspective, that would explain a lot, especially if you think about the Epstein-Bannon interview, which we just live streamed on my channel yesterday or a couple days ago. Epstein basically seems like he's into, Kabbalism and into the occult. So I think there is an overlap there.
So a couple of things here on Kubrick co-wrote, if I remember correctly, he co-wrote the movie Eyes Wide Shut. And it's based on like a 1920s, right? 1920s novella.
Yeah, Traum novella.
Yeah, like a German novella at the time. So it's clear like this has been happening for many decades. right? So this wasn't like a new idea. He's trying to, expose Hollywood. This had been going on for decades, and this was a modern adaptation of something that's been happening for more than hundreds of years.
Yeah. Yeah, we did for example, on my channel, we did a lecture through a book called Sexpionage by just a mainline historian, Walter Bower. And in that book, he says that one of the elements that most people don't realize that has brought down kingdoms, destroyed civilizations, and ended wars is sexpionage, which is the art of sexual compromise, honey traps, blackmail, etc. We've all seen this in movies. If you saw the Jennifer Lawrence movie Red Sparrow, that was about Stalin and the NKVD techniques of training operatives and make them into sex honey traps. But the CIA always supposedly has this line of, well, we don't do that in the West. That's something that China and Russia do. Because we're moral. But the reality is that just simply they don't do it under the cover of the CIA. They use other things. You think about Operation Midnight Climax. That was an MK Ultra adjacent program that's declassified, where the CIA was wanting to study the effects of LSD on Johns in the midst of sexual things, liaisons. And so they dosed the Johns using mafia brothels. And so that's Operation Midnight Climax right there. So what does that tell you?
Wow.
That when they say, "Oh, we don't use sexual operatives," well, no, they just farm it out to brothels run by organized crime, which has always had a close relationship with the CIA and the OSS going back to World War II. So yes, you're absolutely right. In fact, there's a famous guy you could look up, Kenji Doihara, as an example. He was the Japanese Jeffrey Epstein back at the turn of the century in the Japanese-Chinese War. He got this idea to set up a bunch of brothels in China and put the prostitutes strategically in the locations near where the Chinese generals lived. And he was able to defeat China through opium and prostitution networks, and the prostitutes were all spies. And so I think that you're starting to see the picture come together. Like, this is a known technique. It's just not known to people unless you've studied, history or military history. Like, this is how the world really works.
So it's like a buffet. You have sexual perversion, sexual rituals, drugs. Like, just choose whatever we can do to control. There's no rules for this kind of thing. Although it seems to be there are rituals. How much do you think the rituals that, as we see in the Epstein files, were organized in these ways? So we see things like, "Thanks, had fun at the hunt." What else do we see? The one that you brought about. MK Ultra grooming this sex kitten about, like, she's smart, she is wounded in this way. We'll try and like groom her and manipulate her in this way. Is it willy-nilly? Is there a schedule? Do you get calendar invited? What do you think?
Great question. Some of that domain is still a little ambiguous and unknown. However, I've got several books from MK Ultra doctors themselves up there on my shelf. I can get them if I need to. For example, John C. Lilly's book, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer. That's all about LSD in human programming and MK Ultra operations. So Jose Delgado has a book up there, Physical Control of the Mind. So these are all real MK Ultra adjacent doctors who were studying these things. And if you think about Alfred Kinsey, his research was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to study underage sexuality. He's the one that, of course, was a notorious PDF with those disgusting experiments that he did on kids. And he's the one that promoted the idea that everybody is on a spectrum gay. So we're all Skittles, we're all rainbow. According to Kinsey, he was a big promoter of, the 60s countercultural sexual revolution type ideology. So when you think about at an academic level, you've got these so-called academics and scientists and sociologists studying this sexuality and then promoting these ideas that become, sort of toxic culture. I think you're spot on when we consider the possibility that the deepest that we can go into the public information on MK Ultra does include fracturing personalities. It does include attempts, at least, at using LSD, according to Lilly, even on young children to program various alters in them in experiments. He explicitly says that at the end of the book. So I would suspect with that email, it looks like a person who was spotting or recruiting for Jeffrey Epstein, looking for people who had, according to him, sexual trauma, which would make them more susceptible to being developed or being, programmed, so to speak, into being some sort of operative. It even gets into weird sort of, I don't believe in X-Men stuff literally, but it's like that, where it's the person can develop abilities or techniques, and we don't know what that stage 3 means, but it does sound like the type of process that you read in some of these MK Ultra doctors in terms of traumatizing and programming people to be operatives. And we see like heads of state, queens, kings, billionaires, they're offering their daughters to Jeffrey and saying, hey, take her, program her. Hey, my son, he's 15. How do I program him to, interact with women? Like, could you give me advice on parenting? Like, just insane. Like, who would ask Jeffrey Epstein for parenting advice? Well, apparently the children of the royals and the elites throughout the world do.
Yeah. I want to circle back to Stanley Kubrick here. He died, I think, was it 2 weeks after he had submitted his final edit? Do I have that timeline?
I forget the exact date, but it was soon.
Yeah. And so the edit that he submitted of the film, we've never seen, right? Unless you've seen it, or maybe, I'm sure maybe,
no, I've not.
Maybe Vivian has seen it. I'm curious if his daughter has seen it.
Yeah, I've asked Vivian about that because, of course, this is a question that's asked a lot, and she says and claims that she doesn't have any information on that, so she doesn't.
Reportedly, it was destroyed, right? I mean, apparently, according to reports, it was destroyed. And so the cut then, Jay, maybe you can talk about this. The cut we ended up seeing in the film removes like a huge swath of the child stuff that he was in. I guess, does Vivian believe that he was exposing it? Like exposing the child rings, and that's why like the Hollywood edits that when we got it finally released, they removed that edit of the film.
My suspicion would be that it was removed because it suggests all of that, and that actually explains some of the details in the cuts that we do have that don't kind of make sense. Some of the little nods, for example, clearly that's what's going on with the Over the Rainbow costume store, because the the guy that runs the costume store sends Lily Sobieski out, who's intentionally underage. She's like supposed to be like around 14 or so. And then she's coming out flirting with Tom Cruise when he's trying to buy this cloak. And then she says, you're going to need an ermine cloak or something like that. And you can't even hear the line because she whispers it unless you have the subtitles on. But that's suggesting that he needs a cloak that European royals and nobility wore. But it's also suggestive that she's been there already. She's been to these parties. So this guy is connected to the parties, and he's a kind of networking fixer. If you remember, when Tom Cruise gets there, he walks in and he sees these two Japanese businessmen that are all dressed up like women, and they're partying with Lily Sobieski, who's, underage, running around in her underwear. So those details, which are kind of odd and they don't really come up elsewhere in the film, make a lot more sense if the cut of the film was suggesting what you're saying.
Now, sometimes I see, the algorithm serves me things about Illuminati type symbolism in, say, a Taylor Swift concert or a Beyonce concert. My sister went to a Beyonce concert and left absolutely convinced that that was all Illuminati symbolism. And what these theories say is that they have to show us what they're doing, that's a part of it. And so you can never tell if something is a warning or a part of this. What do you think of that? And not just this film, but other pop cultural consumptive products.
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's probably all the above, because we have a lot of history of evidence and declassified documents, for example, about a lot of A-list actors being spies. You go back to the World War II era, and we had people that were suspected of being spies, like Marlene Dietrich, who people thought she was a Nazi spy, but she actually worked for, or wanted to work for, the OSS. We have Jimmy Stewart was an informant for the FBI, for example. We have Cary Grant was informing on Errol Flynn for the OSS.
Yeah.
We have a lot of famous people like Julia Child, who were spies for the OSS, and then onwards up into today, where you've got people like Ben Affleck, for example, who openly has talked about working, consulting with the CIA on several films, including Argo,
Argo,
which is
yeah.
ironic because Argo is a film about the CIA doing a fake film during the Iranian Revolution. So
It's also
you've
meta.
got-
Yeah.
yeah, it's super meta. Exactly. It's getting into reality, which is also odd too, with Tom Cruise being so heavy in Scientology and then
Fronting this
elements.
film. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of meta stuff going on with some
Has
of
he
this.
ever indicated that he believes this as a social warning? I don't watch
the only thing
I don't
I
watch
could come up
People
with-
magazine or anything like that.
The only
so
thing I
don't
could
know.
come up with Tom Cruise in this, and I put this in the third book, was that back right after 9/11, there was some public news articles discussing Tom Cruise wanting to be a kind of PR consultant type person promoting the CIA. So I don't know if Tom Cruise is in the CIA or anything like that. The only thing I found is that there were articles right after 9/11 saying Tom wanted to do CIA promotional type stuff. And we've actually seen, if you go watch the clips on YouTube, there's Jennifer Garner has CIA promotionals that she did as a PR operative working for the CIA as well, because she was on the show Alias with J.J. Abrams, who Abrams says the CIA consulted on Alias. So a lot of consultation and this, a lot of propaganda has gone on in films that just people just don't know about. But Wag the Dog, by the way, is a film that's actually about the CIA producing films. Anyway, long story short, I think probably all the above. You've got a lot of blockbusters tend to be heavy with the propaganda because they know so many people are going to be watching those. But there's a lot of art house films, a lot of independent films where the directors really do have a desire, I think, to expose truth and get the truth out there. I've done interviews with Sean Stone. I think several Oliver Stone films had the intention to expose things and get the information out as far as Oliver Stone knew at that time, with JFK or with, the Snowden films. So I think it's all the above.
You mentioned something at the very beginning I wanted to kind of circle back on, which is like this predictive programming, and they're sort of setting us up. Many people in our chat room are saying like this is all like they lay the groundwork for us through Hollywood, right, in books. And we saw that, of course, with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Steven Spielberg reportedly saw one of the famous film, actually, from the United States military, where a craft did land. That's why we got Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And now we get his new Disclosure film, which is coming out this summer. Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day. And as we're moving towards disclosure, I'm hearing reports from different sources that President Trump's team has already written like a UFO disclosure speech that the president is prepared to give. So it's like all coming out now. We're getting, congressional hearings and testimony and documentaries. And now Steven Spielberg is about to launch his big film. It just smells weird to me. It's like he's in on it. We know that's. Well, anyway, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what do you think about the predictive programming? They're about to have a big disclosure moment in the U.S., and Steven Spielberg is helping with it.
Yeah, there's a whole section in the first book, Stark Hollywood 1, where I covered the role of Spielberg, I think, in predictive programming and propaganda. He's definitely a longtime propagandist at a very high level when it comes to stuff, especially back during the Reagan era. Reagan actually appropriated quite a bit of money and focus on, in the 1980s, getting Hollywood to produce very pro-military, pro-USA propaganda, not just for the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviets, but the reinvigorating of the American Imperium, which we later see in the 90s. That's the PNAC document ends up being the same ideology of the neoconservatives to have the rebuilt American empire. So, you saw in the 80s a lot of movies like Top Gun. Again, Tom Cruise is there. Top Gun is a huge military promo film. In fact, it was very successful in getting a lot of people to go into the military, including my dad. My dad thought Top Gun made him want to go into the Navy. So it worked. And there was other films that came out, Navy SEALs and others at that time. So predictive programming has that one level, which is just pure propaganda, but you've also got things like subliminals. That's people have been studying that since the 60s and 70s. That does exist to a degree in advertising and film. You've got the element of perhaps an occult connection, where some directors explicitly believe that their films are ritual workings. I think if you look at people like Darren Aronofsky, he's an open Kabbalist. A lot of his films have a very sort of dark Kabbalistic vibe to them. You've got directors like Robert Eggers, one of the top directors out there now. He's openly interested in Satanism and the occult. He talks about reading grimoires and whatnot, and requiring the actors to read grimoires to understand how to sort of instantiate that sort of dark ethos in their acting. The Stanislavski method, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of layers to predictive programming, but another element I think is, in terms of psychological warfare, one thing that has been studied is that fiction has the ability to sort of prepare you, condition you, and maybe even anesthetize you to the things when they really happen. So you have these dystopian films for many years that talk about things to come, and then lo and behold, they come about, right? Philip K. Dick's stories have been very well noted for that tendency. Isaac Asimov Foundation, you've got texts from the 60s and 70s that predicted the internet, Silicon Valley, tracking, tracing, all these dystopian texts. But are they also conditioning? I would say on the part of Hollywood, yeah, there's a lot of conditioning that they want to, get the public to accept the stuff when it comes out. And probably I would say with the alien mythos, and in my opinion, the aliens are more demonic. It's a demonic phenomena. And in that regard, probably what they're doing is preparing the people for the announcement of some disclosure that, I don't know if you guys have ever read Arthur Clarke's Childhood's End, but Childhood's End is a text written by a guy who was into Crowley, and he was a PDF, right? Arthur C. Clarke, the famous sci-fi guy. And, he co-wrote 2001. Well, Clarke says that it's basically a demon. It's this cloven hoofed, character that's behind the alien phenomena when the aliens arrive and announce their disclosure. I covered that in my first book too, I think, covering the film Signs, the Mel Gibson film, which I think hints at it being demonic.
Gosh. I mean, and I am also sensitive because my grandfather was a survivor of the Japanese Holocaust, that Asians are not allowed to use that word, Holocaust, and that all of the Spielberg programming is only about the Jewish Holocaust and ignoring all of the peripheral tragedies that happened at the exact same time in greater numbers, in fact. And so that seems to me very purposeful, that we are programmed to think of only one group's suffering. So when you tell me that Spielberg is part of a CIA co-op, that makes a lot of sense to me. I guess, I was talking to my mother about this the other day. My mother, she likes to read books that Costco put out, so she likes Michelle Obama and Meghan Markle because of Harry. She's just she's programmed by this various, and I'm like, you have to be really careful, Mom, about celebrity worship because you don't know what's behind it. And she was very, after the Epstein files, amenable to this message, where she hasn't been before, where she's like, don't talk bad about Meghan Markle, which is a hobby of mine. And so, I think that it's helpful that we can see it now. It's important to know it. There's a great comment here. They're supposed to show us what they're doing because it's the sin to ignore it. And I love that framing of it. So, we're here now. We can talk about this in polite society. I think that that's progress.
Absolutely. Yeah. This was something that was absolutely taboo. I read my first text on this subject in 2004. I went and dug this out of my library, and it's a now out of print book, but it's written by a Catholic journalist, and it's called Lucifer's Lodge, and it's the history of SRA in the Catholic Church up to 2004. That was my introduction to this, and I was kind of, shocked, obviously, at the time because I was in my 20s and had no idea that the world was this dark. But you start to realize it's not just one institution, right? It's not just Rome or the Vatican that seems to be tied into these things. You start reading about the history of British intelligence when I was doing my grad work on Ian Fleming. And, well, Ian Fleming, turns out he's writing into his stories, real things that he saw as a high-level British intelligence operative. He's putting it into films that, they're actually involved in international crime, trafficking, blackmail, all of this. So James Bond is actually more of a villain than he is, the hero, if you get into the real history of this stuff. And when I think about, for example, Epstein, right, like he doesn't seem to be he's not a top of the pyramid kind of guy. He's more like a mid-level fixer, crime consultant kind of guy. He's like, let me help you figure out how to do more crimes. Yeah. And then I'm an expert at crime. And then I think about, well, if you remember Inspector, and this is one example, and obviously that film included some propaganda, but the recent James Bond with Daniel Craig and Christoph Waltz, Spectre, who's Waltz is playing Blofeld. There's this great scene where Bond is infiltrating one of their international meetings, and I think it's happening in Rome or something, which made me think of the Club of Rome and that whole document with Maurice Strong and the Rockefellers. But he gets in there and they're having this giant, elite tabletop meeting, and the criminals are all organized. They're all like, "Sir, we have had an upwards tick in $40 billion money laundered this year. Yes, I would like to add that we've had 30,000 more cases of human trafficking, up from last year, 30%. So they're like listing all their crime stats as like how profitable they've been.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is literally the Epstein, the emails are literally like Spectre.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're putting it all out there. Like, oh, well, how do we skirt laws? How do we go around the United States legal system in order to carry this out for human cloning? It's like you're literally reading like an Ian Fleming novel.
Exactly.
It's crazy. I know. Truth is stranger than fiction. Strange. Yeah, we lived down the street from where Ian Fleming worked when he was in Portugal and at the Hotel Palacio there, and just crazy what he was doing at that hotel and during the war and all that. Just fascinating stuff. Jay, thank you for your encyclopedic knowledge of this, and it's been absolutely fascinating. And we hope you'll come back. And obviously, we're going to continue as we go through the other 3 million documents if we ever get our hands on those. And I'm sure there'll be so much more to talk about. But thank you so much for your great work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. And yeah, if anybody wants, you can get Esoteric Hollywood at my website, jaysanalysis.com, in the shop.
What's the name of the website again for people to go to?
jaysanalysis.com, and in the shop there is, so you can get any of my books. 1, 2, and 3. There's 3 episodes now, 3 installments of Esoteric Hollywood. So I just put the 3rd one out, covering basically everything that we covered today, but in 3 different books.
Awesome stuff. Jay, thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it. All right.